The smell of fryer grease never really left your clothes back then. No matter how many times Mom ran David's Burger King uniform through the wash, that distinct aroma of industrial cooking oil clung to the polyester fabric like a badge of honor nobody wanted. November 1987, and he was 17, working 23 hours a week at minimum wage while trying to survive senior year. $3.50 an hour. That's what they paid him to flip Whoppers and scrape the grill and take orders from people who looked through him like he was part of the machinery. David would clock in at 3:30 every weekday, right after the final bell rang at Jefferson High, and he'd work until closing at 10. Then he'd drive home in his mom's hand-me-down '81 Chevy Citation, the one with the faulty heater that only worked when it felt like it, and he'd do homework until midnight or 1, depending on what was due. Did you ever work fast food as a teenager? Did you know that specific exhaustion of standing for 6 hours straight, feet aching and non-slip shoes that cost a week's wages? The Citation was brown. Not a cool brown, not a chocolate or bronze or anything that could be described charitably, just brown. Brown exterior, tan interior, with a rip in the driver's seat where the foam poked through, and that constant smell of old coffee and winter dampness. The radio worked, but only AM stations came in clearly, which meant David spent his drives listening to talk radio or oldie stations playing music that was already old when his parents were young. But it was wheels. It was freedom, even if that freedom came with the responsibility of getting himself to work, to school, to everywhere he needed to be, because Dad worked construction an hour away and Mom's nursing shifts at County General were completely unpredictable. That's what being 17 in 1987 meant for kids like David, not the kids in the John Hughes movies, with their perfect bedrooms and understanding parents and problems that resolved themselves in 90 minutes. Real kids, the ones whose parents were tired, whose houses were okay but not great, whose futures felt both inevitable and terrifyingly uncertain.
Wisconsin winter was coming early that year. Everyone said so. Old-timers at the diner, the weatherman on Channel 7, even Mr. Patterson, who taught government and claimed he could feel it in his war injury from Korea. The first snow had already hit in mid-October, melted away, then come back with a vengeance the first week of November. By the third week, the kind David was living through right now, the snow wasn't going anywhere until April. Senior year was supposed to be the best year. That's what everyone said. The teachers, the graduation speakers from previous years, the posters in the guidance counselor's office showing happy teenagers in caps and gowns. But David spent most of his days exhausted, most of his nights anxious, and most of his free time trying to figure out how to pay for college when his parents had made it clear there was no college fund. Have you ever felt like everyone else got a manual for life that somehow skipped you? Like everyone knew the steps except you were just making it up as you went? The college application sat in a folder in his locker. University of Wisconsin-Madison was the dream, but the price tag made his stomach hurt. UW-Milwaukee was more realistic. The community college in the next county over was the backup plan nobody wanted to talk about, but everyone knew was probably where he'd end up. His guidance counselor, Mrs. Hoffman, kept telling him about scholarships. She'd given him a 3-ring binder full of photocopied applications for scholarships with names like Future Leaders of America and Academic Excellence Award and First Generation College Student Grant. Each one required essays, multiple essays. Essays about leadership, about overcoming adversity, about his goals and dreams, and why he deserved money more than the thousands of other kids applying for the same $300.
David would work on them during his lunch period, sitting in the library instead of the cafeteria, writing about his work ethic and his dedication and his aspirations while his stomach growled because he'd used his lunch money to put gas in the Citation. The library was quieter than the cafeteria anyway. The cafeteria was chaos. Underclassmen screaming, food fights waiting to happen,
That constant roar of 400 teenagers in one room trying to be heard over each other. The library had rules. Silence. Order. Mrs. Chen, the librarian, enforcing both with a look that could stop a charging bull. Remember school libraries? The card catalog, the special pencils, the absolute authority of the librarian who knew where everything was and made you feel like an idiot if you couldn't figure out the Dewey Decimal System? David had discovered something that fall. The library stayed open until 4 o'clock, which meant he had 30 minutes between the final bell and his work shift to exist in a space that wasn't demanding anything from him. He'd spend those 30 minutes doing homework or writing scholarship essays, or sometimes just sitting there, staring at nothing, letting his brain be quiet for the first time all day. Other kids used that time differently. The jocks went to practice, the popular kids hung out by their cars in the parking lot, radios playing, making plans for the weekend. The burnouts disappeared to wherever burnouts went, probably the woods behind the school to smoke cigarettes and complain about how much everything sucked. David wasn't any of those kids. He wasn't a jock, though he'd tried out for JV basketball sophomore year and got cut. He wasn't popular, though he wasn't unpopular either, just invisible in that way that average kids were invisible. And he wasn't a burnout, though some days the appeal of just giving up and not caring about anything seemed incredibly attractive. He was just a kid trying to get through it, trying to graduate, trying to figure out what came next, trying to keep all the plates spinning without dropping any of them and disappointing everyone who was counting on him.
The Burger King where David worked was on Highway 41, between the Piggly Wiggly and the Radio Shack. It served the dinner rush from 5 to 7, families stopping on their way home, truckers passing through, teenagers with cars and money to burn on Whoppers and fries. The manager was a guy named Dale, who was 30-something and had worked his way up from crew member to assistant manager to manager over the course of 8 years. He wore his title like a badge of honor, like managing a Burger King in a town of 12,000 people was something to be proud of. Maybe it was. David didn't know anymore. Everyone had to work. Everyone had to pay bills. Dale had a wife and 2 kids and a mortgage, and the Burger King paid him enough to handle all 3. Was that success? Was that failure? Was that just life? Did you have a job in high school? Did you work for someone who treated that job like it was the most important thing in the world, even when you both knew it wasn't? The worst part of working at Burger King wasn't the actual work. David didn't mind the repetition, the muscle memory of assembling burgers, the choreography of the kitchen during a rush. The worst part was running into people from school. Teachers coming through the drive-thru, seeing him in that polyester uniform and paper hat, their expressions shifting from neutral to pitying in the space of a second. Classmates ordering food, making jokes about him being their servant now, asking if he got an employee discount. Girls he'd had crushes on suddenly seeing him as the Burger King guy instead of just David. There was something deeply humiliating about being seen in that uniform, about having your economic reality on display for everyone who walked through those doors. Rich kids, and even in a small Wisconsin town there were rich kids, they didn't work at Burger King. They didn't work at all, or if they did, they had cushy jobs, filing papers at their dad's office or helping out at a family friend's business where nobody actually expected them to do anything.
But kids like David? They worked at Burger King or McDonald's or the grocery store or the gas station. They worked real jobs with real responsibilities, and they got paid minimum wage, and everyone looked at them like they were somehow less than. Thanksgiving was 5 days away. The school was doing that thing schools do where they pretend everyone's life is a Norman Rockwell painting. Paper turkeys on the walls, bulletin boards asking students what they're thankful for, the whole building smelling like the cafeteria's attempt at a Thanksgiving feast, that weird institutional version of turkey and mashed potatoes that tasted like cardboard and obligation. David's family did Thanksgiving at his aunt and uncle's house every year. His mom's sister and her husband, their 3 kids who were all younger and annoying, his grandparents who were getting older and quieter each year, and usually a random assortment of cousins and second cousins and family friends who had nowhere else to go. It was fine. It was family. It was tradition. But it also meant giving up one of his few days off from both school and work, putting on his good clothes, the khakis and polo shirt he wore to church the 3 times a year they actually went, and spending 6 hours making small talk with relatives who asked the same questions every year. How's school? What are your plans after graduation? Have you applied to colleges yet? Do you have a girlfriend? What do you want to major in? The questions came rapid fire from people who didn't really want answers, just wanted to feel like they'd done their familial duty by showing interest in the younger generation. David had perfected his responses over the years. Short, polite, non-committal enough that nobody could criticize him, but nobody felt compelled to dig deeper.
School's good. Still figuring out my plans. Applied to a few places. No girlfriend right now. Maybe business or communications. All lies, or at least partial truth, stretched thin enough to be socially acceptable. School was hard. His plans terrified him. He'd applied to places he couldn't afford. He'd never had a girlfriend because he was either at school or at work, and girls wanted boys with time and money and confidence, none of which he had. And he had no idea what he wanted to study because he'd spent the last 4 years just trying to survive, not trying to build a future. Do you remember those family gatherings where everyone asked about your future and you had to pretend you had one figured out? Where you smiled and nodded and felt like a fraud the entire time? The high school had a basketball game the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Jefferson High versus their rival, Lakewood. David went, not because he cared about basketball anymore, but because going to the game was what you did. It was social currency. It was being part of something. It was having a life beyond work and homework and stress. The gym was packed. Small-town Wisconsin high school basketball was serious business. The student section was loud, organized, doing coordinated chants that probably violated several school policies, but the administration ignored because school spirit or whatever. The band played between quarters, butchering songs everyone recognized, but nobody could quite place. The cheerleaders did their routines and the players did their warm-ups, and the whole thing felt both incredibly important and completely meaningless at the same time. David sat in the middle of the bleachers with Mark and Tyler, 2 guys who existed in his same social strata of visible invisibility. They weren't friends exactly, but they knew each other well enough to sit together at events like this and not feel weird about it. They'd probably never talk after graduation, probably wouldn't even recognize each other at the 10-year reunion, but for now, they were basketball game companions.
Jefferson lost by 12 points. The crowd still cheered like they'd won. That's how small-town sports worked. You supported your team regardless of whether they were any good. You showed up, you screamed yourself hoarse, you pretended that high school basketball mattered because in towns like this, sometimes it was all that did matter. After the game, everyone migrated to the parking lot. This was the real social event. The milling around cars, the making plans, the figuring out whose house had parents who weren't home, whose older sibling could buy beer, where the party was happening. David watched it all from the periphery, knowing he wouldn't be invited even if he wanted to go, knowing he had an opening shift at Burger King the next morning that started at 6 a.m. The citations started on the 3rd try. That was normal. The engine would turn over, sputter, die, then again, then finally catch and rumble to life with a sound that suggested it might not make it through the winter. David let it warm up, or tried to since the heater worked on its own schedule, and watched the groups forming and reforming in the parking lot. Some kids had nice cars, new cars, cars their parents had bought them for their 16th birthdays or their graduation presents in advance. Mustangs and Camaros and those boxy Jeep Wranglers that were everywhere in '87. Cars with working heaters and stereos that played cassettes instead of just AM radio. Did you ever sit in a parking lot and watch everyone else's life seem easier than yours?
Watch them make plans you weren't part of, in cars you couldn't afford, going places you didn't have time for. David drove home in silence. The AM radio was playing some talk show he couldn't focus on, and the heater was doing its usual thing of blowing cold air, so he just drove in the quiet in the dark, watching the streetlights pass overhead, counting down the blocks until he could be home.
Home was a ranch house on Maple Street. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 70s, and a living room dominated by a massive console television that weighed approximately 1,000 pounds and picked up 6 channels if the weather cooperated. His parents had bought the house in 1975, right after they got married, and they'd been paying the mortgage ever since. It was fine. It was home. The roof didn't leak, the furnace worked most of the time, and they had enough space that David wasn't sharing a bedroom with anyone. Some of his classmates weren't so lucky. He knew kids who slept on couches, kids who shared rooms with 2 or 3 siblings, kids whose families moved every year because they couldn't make rent. So yeah, the house was fine. Mom was still awake when David got home from the basketball game. She was always awake, or at least it seemed that way, working 12-hour shifts at the hospital, coming home to cook dinner, doing laundry, paying bills, and somehow still finding the energy to wait up and make sure her son got home safe. She sat at the kitchen table in her scrubs, a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, the newspaper spread out with the classifieds circled in red pen. She looked up when David came in, and the young man could see the exhaustion in her face, the kind that didn't go away with sleep, the kind that lived in your bones after years of working too hard for too little. She smiled anyway, because that's what mothers did. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the furnace kicking on. Dad was already asleep. He had to be up at 4:30 to make it to the construction site by 6. David's younger sister, Katie, was hopefully doing homework in her room, but more likely talking on the phone, tying up the line like she did every night until someone yelled at her to hang up. David grabbed a glass of water and sat down across from his mother. They didn't say anything for a minute. They didn't need to. This was their routine. He'd come home, she'd be there, and they'd sit in comfortable silence before both heading to bed to do it all again tomorrow. How many nights did you spend at the kitchen table with a parent, both of you too tired to talk, but grateful for the company anyway?
November in Wisconsin meant darkness by 5 p.m. It meant scraping frost off your windshield every morning. It meant layers, long underwear beneath jeans, sweaters under coats, gloves that never quite kept your fingers warm enough. It meant the world shrinking down to the spaces between home, school, and work, with nothing else mattering, because everything else was too cold, too dark, too far away. David's Wednesday shift at Burger King started at 3:30, same as always. He'd developed a system over the months he'd been working there. Clock in, tie the apron, check the schedule to see which station he'd been assigned. Grill, fry station, front counter, drive-thru, each had its own particular form of monotony, its own brand of stress. Wednesday put him on drive-thru, the headset that never sat quite right, leaving his ears sore by the end of the shift, the constant stream of orders coming through, needing to be repeated back, entered into the register, money collected, change counted, food handed out, all while maintaining that fake cheerful tone that corporate demanded. The drive-thru timer was David's enemy. Corporate said each order needed to be completed in 90 seconds or less. From the moment a car pulled up to the speaker to the moment they drove away from the window, 90 seconds. Dale would check the times at the end of each shift, and if the average was too high, he'd give this disappointed look and talk about efficiency and customer satisfaction and meeting goals. Nobody talked about how achieving those times meant cutting corners, handing people food that was sitting under the heat lamps instead of fresh, skipping the "would you like to try" upsells, throwing change at people instead of counting it carefully, making everything about speed instead of quality or accuracy, or treating customers like actual human beings. But that's what minimum wage bought you. Speed,
Efficiency. The bare minimum of human interaction required to exchange money for food. Did you ever work a job where you were timed, where every second mattered and falling behind meant getting lectured by a manager who made 50 cents more an hour than you?
The evening rush hit at 5:15, like clockwork, like every Wednesday. Families coming through, ordering multiple meals, kids screaming in the back seat, parents exhausted and short-tempered, truckers needing coffee and something to eat before the next leg of their route, teenagers in cars they'd borrowed or saved up for, pooling money for burgers and fries because it was Wednesday night and there was nothing else to do in this town. David took orders, repeated them back, collected money, made change, handed out bags of food, and said the required phrases with the required enthusiasm, even though every cell in his body wanted to be anywhere else. His feet hurt. His back hurt. The headset was giving him a headache. The smell of fryer grease had permanently embedded itself in his sinuses. But he smiled. He said thank you. He asked if they wanted to make it a large for only 39 cents more, because that's what the job required, and he needed this job, and complaining about it wouldn't change anything. Tyler, who worked the fry station on Wednesdays, had this theory that you could tell everything about a person by how they treated fast food workers. People who said please and thank you probably had it together in life. People who screamed about missing ketchup packets or wrong orders or having to wait an extra minute were probably miserable in every aspect of their existence and taking it out on the nearest available target. David thought Tyler was probably right. He'd seen enough people lose their minds over a forgotten straw or slightly warm soda to know that some folks carried their anger around looking for any excuse to let it out. And teenagers in polyester uniforms making $3.50 an hour were easy, consequence-free targets. One guy that evening, middle-aged, driving a nice truck, wearing a Packers jacket, threw his entire order back through the window because the onions were on his burger when he'd specifically said no onions. Except David had the order slip right there, and it didn't say no onions. But that didn't matter. The guy screamed. Dale had to come over, they remade the order. The guy drove off, and Dale looked at David like somehow this was his fault.
Welcome to customer service, where the customer was always right, even when they were objectively, provably wrong. The citations heater finally decided to work on the drive home that night. Of course it did. 10 o'clock, shift over, temperature dropping into the teens, and now the heater wanted to cooperate. David drove home with warm air blasting and the AM radio playing some oldies station, some song from the 60s about love and happiness and simpler times that probably weren't actually simpler, just filtered through nostalgia and selective memory. Homework waited at home, an essay for English on the Great Gatsby that was due Friday, math problems that should have been done last week, a chapter to read for history about World War II, which Mr. Patterson would definitely quiz them on because he quizzed them on everything. But it was 10:30 by the time David got home, and he had to be up at 6 for school, and his brain felt like sludge. He sat at his desk, the same desk he'd had since middle school, scarred with pen marks and stickers from bands he'd liked years ago, and stared at his textbooks and tried to summon the energy to care. How many nights did you fall asleep at your desk? How many times did you wake up with a textbook imprint on your face, still in your clothes, having gotten maybe 3 hours of actual sleep? The thing about being 17 in 1987, in any year really, but that year in particular for David, was that nobody seemed to understand that you couldn't do everything. Teachers acted like theirs was the only class that mattered. Parents had expectations about grades and college and the future. Work wanted more hours, more availability, more flexibility. Friends wanted you to hang out, to go to parties, to be present in your own teenage life.
And you were supposed to do all of it. Be a perfect student, be a responsible employee, be a good son or daughter, be a social teenager, sleep enough, eat right, exercise, plan for your future, live in the moment, save money, experience life. It was impossible. But everyone acted like it wasn't. Everyone acted like if you just tried harder, managed your time better, prioritized correctly, you could have it all. But you couldn't. Something always suffered, usually multiple things. David's social life was basically non-existent. His grades were okay, but not great. B's and C's instead of the A's he'd gotten freshman and sophomore year before work became mandatory. His health was whatever. He was tired all the time, surviving on fast food and whatever mom cooked, probably not getting enough of any important vitamin or nutrient. His future plans were a mess of anxiety and uncertainty and forms he couldn't afford to fill out properly. But he was showing up every day to everything. And maybe that had to be enough. Friday came as Fridays do, the last day of school before Thanksgiving break, which meant everyone was checked out mentally even though teachers still tried to teach actual content. David's English teacher, Mrs. Morrison, attempted to lead a discussion about symbolism in The Great Gatsby, while half the class passed notes and the other half stared blankly at the clock, counting down the minutes until freedom. The green light, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, the Valley of Ashes, all these metaphors for the American dream and corruption and the emptiness of wealth that were probably important, but felt completely disconnected from David's reality. He wasn't worried about the corruption of the American dream. He was worried about affording the application fees for colleges he probably wouldn't get into anyway. Did you ever sit in English class and think none of this matters? That analyzing symbolism in a novel wouldn't help you pay rent or get a job or figure out your actual life? Lunch period on that Friday was chaos. Everyone hyped up about the 4-day weekend, making plans, comparing notes on whose house was free for parties, who was traveling where, what everyone was doing. The cafeteria served its attempt at a pre-Thanksgiving meal: turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, rolls, green beans that had been boiled into submission. It actually wasn't terrible, which surprised everyone.
David ate alone, not because he didn't have people to sit with, but because he'd learned that eating alone was easier. No pressure to contribute to conversations, no feeling left out when plans were made that didn't include him. Just him and his mediocre turkey and 30 minutes of relative peace before afternoon classes. Mark passed by, tray in hand, and dropped into the seat across from David without asking. They'd reached that level of acquaintance where sitting together didn't require permission or explanation. Mark worked at the Piggly Wiggly, stocking shelves on weekends, so he understood the reality of working through high school in a way that kids without jobs never would. They ate in comfortable silence, occasionally commenting on the food or the noise level, or the fact that Mrs. Henderson was wearing the same dress she'd worn last Thanksgiving, which had apparently become her Turkey Day tradition. These weren't deep conversations. They weren't bonding moments. They were just two tired teenagers acknowledging each other's existence in the chaos. That evening's Burger King shift was mercifully dead. Thanksgiving prep had everyone cooking at home. Nobody wanted fast food. David spent most of his shift cleaning, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, restocking supplies that didn't need restocking, doing busy work to fill the hours. Dale let him and Tyler go early, at 9 instead of 10, which felt like winning the lottery. The extra hour meant David could actually do his homework, could actually sleep, could actually breathe for a minute without feeling like he was drowning in obligations. The citation started on the first try, and the heater worked immediately. Maybe things were looking up. Maybe the universe was cutting him a break. Or maybe it was just coincidence and random mechanical luck, but David chose to take it as a good sign anyway. Saturday was his day off. No school, no work, theoretically a day to rest or catch up or do something fun. In reality, it meant sleeping until 10, which felt like a luxury beyond measure, then spending the afternoon working on college essays and scholarship applications because the deadlines were approaching and he couldn't put them off any longer.
The dining room table became his workspace. Applications spread out, requiring information he didn't have or couldn't remember. Mom's income,
Dad's income, their tax information from last year, how many siblings he had, whether anyone in his family had attended college, boxes to check, lines to fill, essays to write. Each scholarship wanted something different. One wanted an essay about overcoming adversity. Another wanted a description of community service. A third wanted him to explain his career goals in 500 words or less. A fourth wanted letters of recommendation from teachers who barely knew his name. Did you spend your weekends filling out forms? Did you write essay after essay about your dreams and goals, knowing thousands of other kids were writing the same things, competing for the same small pile of money? The University of Wisconsin-Madison application sat at the bottom of the pile. The dream school, the place he'd wanted to go since freshman year when they'd taken a field trip there and he'd walked around the campus and felt for the first time like maybe there was a world beyond this small town where he could be someone different, someone with a future that wasn't predetermined by his zip code and his parents' income. But the price tag made it almost laughable. Tuition, room, board, fees, books. It added up to more than his parents made in 6 months combined. Even with scholarships, even with financial aid, even working full-time in the summers and part-time during the school year, the math didn't work. The numbers didn't add up. The dream didn't make sense when you looked at it logically. But he filled out the application anyway, wrote the essays, asked for the letters of recommendation, sent in the application fee that represented 2 shifts at Burger King, because hope. Because what else was he supposed to do? Sunday meant church, because Mom insisted, even though nobody particularly wanted to go. The Methodist church on 3rd Street where they'd been going since David was baptized as a baby. The same hymns every week, the same prayers, the same sermon about being grateful and faithful and trusting in God's plan. The same people in the same pews, wearing the same Sunday clothes, going through the same motions because that's what you did.
David sat between his parents, Katie fidgeting on Mom's other side, and let the service wash over him. The organ playing, the congregation singing off-key, the pastor droning on about something David would forget the moment they walked outside. An hour of his life he'd never get back, spent in uncomfortable pants and a tie that felt like it was strangling him. But it made Mom happy. It was tradition. It was community. And in a town this small, community mattered, even when you didn't want it to. After church, Mom went full Thanksgiving prep mode. Even though they were going to Aunt Linda's house on Thursday, even though Linda would do most of the cooking, Mom still insisted on bringing dishes, pies, apple and pumpkin, made from scratch because store-bought wasn't good enough, a green bean casserole, homemade rolls, cranberry sauce that nobody would eat, but Mom made anyway because it was tradition. The kitchen became a war zone of flour and sugar and butter. David was drafted into helping, peeling apples, measuring ingredients, mixing dough. His sister managed to disappear, probably to her room to talk on the phone for the next 4 hours. Dad was in the garage, allegedly organizing tools, but really just hiding from the cooking chaos. Remember helping your mom cook for Thanksgiving? The floury countertops, the kitchen smelling like cinnamon and vanilla, the way she'd criticize your peeling technique, but let you help anyway? By Sunday evening, the house smelled like the holidays. Pies cooling on the counter, dough rising in covered bowls. The recipe cards Mom had inherited from her mother, stained and worn, spread across the table like artifacts from another time. This was heritage. This was tradition. This was the thing that connected them to generations before, the thread that ran from grandmother to mother to son, measuring out in cups of flour and tablespoons of sugar. David had homework to do. The essay for English still wasn't finished. The math problem still waited. But for this moment, standing in the kitchen with his mother,
watching her work with the casual competence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. He let himself just be present, just be here, just be a son, helping his mother prepare for a holiday that would come and go like all the others, leaving nothing but memories and maybe, if he was lucky, a piece of leftover pie.
Monday meant back to school for 3 days before break. The building had that pre-holiday energy where nobody wanted to be there, students or teachers. Classes became study halls, assignments became busy work. Everyone was going through the motions, counting down the hours until Wednesday afternoon when they could escape. David's schedule meant first period math, where they took a quiz nobody was prepared for, second period history, where Mr. Patterson showed a documentary about D-Day that they'd definitely seen last year, third period English, where Mrs. Morrison finally gave up on teaching and let them read silently, fourth period chemistry, which was actually a lab, so they had to pay attention or risk blowing something up, lunch, then study hall, then 2 more classes that blurred together into a haze of anticipation and boredom. The hallways between classes were packed with the usual chaos. Freshmen getting shoved into lockers, couples making out by the water fountains, groups of popular kids blocking the path while they talked about parties and plans. Teachers yelling about walking, not running, even though everyone knew the 5-minute passing period wasn't enough to get from the science wing to the math building if you didn't run. This was high school. This was senior year. This was supposed to be the best time of his life, according to every adult who'd forgotten how much it actually sucked to be 17 and confused and tired and scared about the future. David's locker was on the 2nd floor, between the band room and the girls' bathroom. He'd lucked into a bottom locker, which meant he didn't have to deal with someone else's stuff falling on him every time they opened their door. Small victories. That's what you celebrated in high school. Small, meaningless victories that made the day slightly less terrible.
The locker held textbooks too heavy to carry home every night, a gym bag that probably needed to be washed, the folder with scholarship applications, a mirror on the door that he never used, random papers shoved in with no organization because organizational systems were for people who had time and energy for that sort of thing. Did you have a locker? Was it organized or a disaster? Did you ever get assigned a top locker and hate whoever had the bottom locker for having it easier than you? Tuesday's Burger King shift was brutal. Not because it was busy, it wasn't, but because Dale decided this was the perfect time to implement some new corporate training module about customer engagement. Everyone had to watch a video in the break room about smiling more, using customers' names, upselling with enthusiasm. The video showed teenagers who definitely weren't actual fast food workers, all perfectly diverse and attractive and enthusiastic about making people happy with hamburgers. They smiled these huge, fake smiles and said their scripted lines with conviction and acted like working at Burger King was the fulfillment of their deepest dreams. David watched and tried not to laugh. Tyler gave up and laughed openly. Dale paused the video and gave them a speech about attitude and professionalism and representing the brand. Then he played the rest of the video, and they all pretended to take it seriously. And afterward, they signed a form saying they'd completed the training and would implement these new techniques starting immediately. They didn't. Nobody did. Because you couldn't genuinely engage with customers when you were understaffed, underpaid, and working with equipment that barely functioned. You couldn't smile enthusiastically when your feet hurt and you'd been breathing fryer grease for 4 hours. You couldn't upsell with conviction when you knew the food was mediocre at best and overpriced for what it was. But corporate didn't care about reality. They cared about metrics and numbers, and mystery shoppers who would come through and rate your performance based on whether you'd recited the proper script. So you learned to perform. You learned to smile on demand. You learned to say what they wanted to hear while internally counting down the minutes until your shift ended.
That was the real lesson of working retail or fast food as a teenager. Not work ethic or responsibility or customer service skills. It was learning to perform emotions you didn't feel for people who didn't care, for wages that weren't enough because the alternative was not having money at all. Wednesday afternoon, school let out early for Thanksgiving break. 1 p.m. dismissal, and the building emptied like someone had pulled a fire alarm. Buses loaded with kids going home, cars peeling out of the parking lot, teachers escaping to their own families and their own Thanksgiving plans. David had the day off from work, one of only 3 days all year Burger King actually closed. The citations started easily, the heater worked, and for once the drive home felt less like obligation and more like actual freedom. 4 days. No school, no work, just family and food and maybe a chance to breathe. Thursday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of November day that made staying in bed feel like the only reasonable choice. But David's alarm went off at 8, and Mom was already in the kitchen, and the smell of pumpkin pie from yesterday's baking filled the house with warmth that the furnace couldn't match. The young man lay there for a moment, staring at his ceiling, at the glow-in-the-dark stars he'd stuck up there in 6th grade that barely glowed anymore. 17 years old, senior year halfway done, 6 months until graduation. The future pressing in from all sides like the Wisconsin winter, inevitable, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. But it was Thanksgiving, a day for gratitude, supposedly, a day to count blessings and appreciate what you had instead of worrying about what you didn't. David got up, showered, put on the khakis and polo shirt that constituted his formal wear, helped Mom load the car with dishes wrapped in aluminum foil and covered with dish towels to keep them warm. Dad was already outside, scraping ice off the windshield of their Oldsmobile, the good car they used for family events. Katie was moving in slow motion, complaining about having to go, about having to see the cousins, about having to wear a dress.
The drive to Aunt Linda's took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of Dad driving carefully on roads that might be icy, Mom reminding him where to turn even though they'd made this drive every year for the past decade, Katie with her headphones on listening to her Walkman, and David staring out the window at the landscape of bare trees and snow-covered fields that all looked the same. Aunt Linda's house was bigger than theirs. Uncle Tom worked in insurance, made decent money, and had the kind of job where he wore a tie every day and came home at reasonable hours. Their house reflected that comfort. Updated kitchen, furniture that matched, a basement finished as a rec room where the kids could escape the adults. Cars already filled the driveway when they arrived. Grandparents were there, their ancient Buick parked closest to the door because Grandpa's hip made walking difficult. Cousin Sarah's beat-up Honda, Uncle Mike's pickup truck, the whole extended family gathering in one place, carrying casserole dishes and pies and bottles of wine, hugging hello and commenting on how much everyone had grown. Aunt Linda hugged David too tight, her perfume overwhelming. Uncle Tom shook his hand with that firm grip men use to assert dominance or test character or whatever. The cousins, Emily, Josh, and little Madison, ran around screaming with the kind of energy that only children possessed. Grandma sat in the good chair by the fireplace, Grandpa beside her, both of them looking smaller than David remembered from last year. The house smelled like turkey and stuffing and all the traditional foods that appeared once a year and somehow tasted like memory itself. The dining room table was extended to its full length, covered with the good tablecloth, set with mismatched chairs borrowed from every room in the house. The TV in the living room played football, the Lions game that nobody really watched, but everyone referenced, the background noise of American Thanksgiving.
The men congregated in the living room, talking about the game, about work, about politics, in that careful way people discussed politics with family members whose views they weren't entirely sure about. The women took over the kitchen, coordinating the final meal preparations, a choreography they'd perfected over years of hosting and attending these gatherings. The kids disappeared to the basement except when called to set the table or help with some small task that made them feel included. David existed in the in-between space, too old for the kids' table, too young for the adults' conversations. Not quite a child, not quite a man. 17 and stuck in the liminal space of almost adulthood, where nobody knew quite how to categorize him. He ended up in the kitchen, watching his mother and aunt and grandmother move around each other with practiced efficiency. They talked while they worked, about family gossip, about people David half knew or didn't know at all, about the small dramas and celebrations that made up everyday life. Someone's daughter got engaged, someone's son got promoted, someone's cousin was having trouble with their marriage, but nobody was supposed to know about that. The food came together slowly, then all at once. Turkey carved and plated, mashed potatoes whipped and buttered, stuffing spooned into bowls. Green beans, cranberry sauce, rolls, gravy, every traditional dish arranged on the table in abundance that seemed almost obscene when David thought about how many people in the world didn't have enough to eat. But that wasn't the kind of thought you voiced on Thanksgiving. Gratitude was the theme. Appreciation for blessings. Thanks for family and health and the good fortune of being American in 1987, when the economy was decent and the country felt relatively stable, and the future seemed, if not bright, at least navigable. Everyone gathered around the table. The adults claimed the actual chairs, while the younger cousins got the folding chairs at the kids' end, and David found himself squeezed between his sister and cousin Sarah, who smelled like cigarettes she didn't want anyone to know about. Uncle Tom said grace, the same grace he said every year, thanking God for family and blessings and this food they were about to receive.
Then the eating began. Plates passed around the table in both directions, everyone taking more than they could eat because that was the tradition. Conversations overlapping, someone asking about school, someone else talking about work, kids laughing at something, Grandpa telling the same story he told every year about Thanksgiving during the war. The food was good. The food was always good. But David found himself eating mechanically, going through the motions. Turkey, potatoes, stuffing, green beans. Everything tasted right, looked right, smelled right. Everything was exactly as it should be, and somehow that made it worse. This was his future, stretching out ahead, every year the same house, the same meal, the same conversations. Maybe someday he'd be the one hosting, married to someone he hadn't met yet, cooking turkey for his own kids who would sit at this table, bored and waiting to escape. The cycle repeating, generation after generation, small-town Thanksgiving after small-town Thanksgiving. Or maybe he'd escape. Maybe college would be the door that opened onto something different. Maybe Madison or Milwaukee or somewhere would become home, and he'd come back here only once a year, an outsider looking in at the life he'd left behind. Maybe he'd sit at this table someday and feel nostalgic for what this was, for these exact moments he was currently enduring. The meal ended the way Thanksgiving meals always ended. Everyone too full, claiming they couldn't eat another bite, then eating pie anyway because that was the tradition. Pumpkin and apple, served with whipped cream or ice cream or both. Coffee for the adults, milk for the kids, everyone lounging in food comas while football continued on the TV and someone suggested playing cards later. David helped clear the table, carried dishes to the kitchen where Mom and Aunt Linda were already organizing leftovers into containers, scraped plates into the garbage while Dad and Uncle Tom argued good-naturedly about whether the Lions had any chance at a winning season. Normal. Everything completely normal. The afternoon stretched out in that timeless way holidays had. No work, no school, no obligations, beyond being present in this moment with these people. The younger cousins went back to the basement. The adults played cards at the cleared dining table. David found himself on the couch with Katie and cousin Sarah watching a movie on VHS that someone had rented. Something with Tom Cruise that Sarah claimed was good, but David couldn't focus on.
His mind was elsewhere,
on the scholarship applications still sitting incomplete at home, on the college decisions that would arrive in March or April, on the future that felt simultaneously too close and impossibly far away, on the fact that in 6 months he'd graduate, and then what? Then work full-time at Burger King while going to community college? Move to Milwaukee for UW if he somehow got in and somehow found the money? Stay here in this town where everyone knew your name and your parents' names and your grandparents' names? Where nothing ever really changed except the people got older and died and were replaced by new people who would do the same things in the same ways? The movie ended. Someone suggested going for a walk to work off the meal. David volunteered immediately, needing air, needing movement, needing to be somewhere other than this living room that felt increasingly like a museum of his own past and future. The walk included Katie, Sarah, and Emily, an odd grouping across age ranges, but they all needed the same escape. The November air was sharp and cold, the sun already low, even though it wasn't yet 4 o'clock. They walked the neighborhood, past houses David had seen 100 times, past the elementary school where he'd gone to kindergarten, past the park where he'd played Little League baseball and broken his wrist falling off the swings in 3rd grade. Sarah smoked a cigarette she'd hidden in her jacket, not caring that the younger girls saw. She was 19, working at the mall, dating some guy with a motorcycle. She asked David about his plans, about college, about whether he wanted to get out of here. He gave the standard answers, the polite ones, the ones that didn't reveal the terror underneath. Katie ran ahead with Emily, the two of them laughing at something, young enough that the future was still abstract. David envied them that. Envied the years they had before the pressure mounted, before every decision felt weighted with consequences. They circled back to the house as darkness fell. The windows glowed warm with light. Cars still filled the driveway. Inside, the adults would be settling into the evening portion of the holiday. More coffee, maybe some board games, definitely more food that nobody needed but everyone would eat anyway.
David stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at that house, at that warmth, at that scene of American family normalcy. Part of him wanted to be inside, part of that comfort and tradition. Part of him wanted to run, to drive the citation anywhere else, to escape this predetermined future that felt like it was swallowing him whole. But he went inside, because that's what you did. You showed up. You participated. You played your role in the family story, even when you felt like a stranger in your own life. The evening passed. More pie, more coffee, more conversation that David participated in without really being present. Finally, the goodbyes began. The gathering of coats and dishes and children, the hugs and promises to see each other at Christmas, the slow dispersal of family back to their separate homes, their separate lives. The drive home was quiet. Dad focused on the dark roads. Mom dozed in the passenger seat. Katie had her headphones on, and David stared out the window at the darkness broken occasionally by street lights or the glow of houses where other families were doing exactly what his had just done. Home felt different when they walked in. Quieter, smaller. Just the 4 of them instead of the extended clan. Mom went immediately to put leftovers in the fridge. Dad turned on the TV to catch the end of the evening game. Katie disappeared to her room to call her friends and compare Thanksgiving notes. David stood in the kitchen, helping unpack the dishes they'd brought home, the containers of leftovers that would be lunch and dinner for the next 3 days. His mother moved around him with efficient exhaustion, putting things away, washing dishes that didn't need immediate washing, keeping busy because that's what she did. She looked at her son, really looked at him, and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe. Recognition that he was struggling with something she couldn't fix. She reached out and squeezed his shoulder, a brief moment of connection that said more than words could.
The rest of the weekend passed in a blur of leftover turkey sandwiches and try to finish homework
and avoiding thinking about Monday's return to reality. David worked on scholarship essays and fragments, writing and deleting and rewriting the same paragraphs about his goals and dreams and why he deserved opportunities that thousands of other kids wanted just as badly. Sunday night, lying in bed, staring at those fading glow-in-the-dark stars, David thought about gratitude, about Thanksgiving and what it was supposed to mean. He had a family. He had a home. He had food and clothes and opportunities that billions of people around the world would never have. He had parents who worked themselves to exhaustion, trying to provide a better life than they'd had. He should be grateful. He was grateful. But gratitude didn't erase the fear, didn't make the future feel less overwhelming, didn't answer the question of what came next. After graduation, after this moment of suspended transition between childhood and whatever adulthood turned out to be, Monday arrived with the alarm clock's buzz. Back to school, back to work, back to the routine of surviving day by day, week by week, until graduation arrived and forced decisions he didn't feel ready to make. David got up, showered, put on his school clothes, grabbed his backpack with the unfinished homework and the folder of applications, walked out to the citation that started on the second try, the heater working for once, the AM radio playing some song he didn't recognize. He drove to school through the gray November morning, the same route he'd driven 100 times before, the same town he'd known his entire life, the same future pressing in from all sides. But he drove. He showed up. He kept going. Because that's what you did when you were 17 in 1987, working minimum wage and trying to build a future from nothing but hope and effort and the stubborn belief that maybe, somehow, it would all work out. Tell us in the comments, what job did you work as a teenager? Where did that future you were so scared of end up taking you?